Hi, everyone. Welcome to Pbis in the virtual classroom. Let's go ahead and get started. So today you are watching this recorded webinar, and we are happy to have you here. If you'd like to access the materials that go along with this training, please access the bit.ly here, and you'll find a folder of materials that you can use to review or use to implement the things that we have learned today. You can also scan this QR code with your phone or iPad or tablet. We want to introduce ourselves to you all today. My name is Dr. Christian Linderman. I am a school climate specialist at OSSI in the Division of Teaching and Learning. For this, I was an elementary school teacher, a middle school teacher. I ran an alternative school, and I also coordinated some RJ interventions. And I support around school climate and culture at OSSI, provide trainings like these and also technical assistance. So if you're interested in bringing something like this to your school or to your work, please email me. I am super excited to work with you and meet you. And now I'm going to pass it over to my co-facilitator, Jessica, who is joining us today.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Christian. My name is Jessica Dulé, and I'm also the school climate specialist. And I focused on a lot of the PD that is centered around Pbis, MTSS in general, also working with our biggest initiative for Restorative DC and the social emotional learning. And those are our emails if in case you want to find out more information about any of the supports that we offer, you can get our emails off of this slide here. So the objectives of this training is that we're going to start off by identifying key components of tiered intervention systems. And then we're going to look at how positive behavior supports are used in the virtual classroom or can be applied in the virtual classroom. And then what can we do to integrate culturally responsive principles to our positive behavior supports? So again, we started off with our introductions. We'll start off with an overview of what Pbis is, and then we'll go into the essential components of what is needed in a Pbis system. And then we'll close with any other last minute information. All right, so I'm going to start off with just an overview of what Pbis is so that we start off with a shared understanding. And to do that, we're going to just show you a quick visual of what the foundations of Pbis is. So as you can see here, Pbis is a data-driven decision-making framework. It's not a package or it's not something that you can buy off the internet. It's a framework that we use to create an effective learning environment. But within that, we also want to make sure that we are establishing values that reflect the social culture of the community that we're serving. And again, this framework is used for all students, families, and staff. And the intention is we use this framework to increase effectiveness and efficiency. And we're always trying to look for a process where we're continuously improving what our practices are. And that, of course, is taken from the OSEP Center on Pbis. And so I'm going to start off with a graphic that is important, I think, in rooting what Pbis is. And so in this circle graphic, you'll see that we want to start off with what are the outcomes that we want to see in our school? What is our vision, and what are the things that we want to measure in terms of what we want our school culture and climate to be? And then we look at our data and we look at and see what is our current reality? Where are we and where do we need to go in order to reach those outcomes? And we look at outcome data such as social behavior, academic achievement, and then we also want to progress monitor our efforts. And we also want to make sure that we're looking at fidelity. So are we doing the practices as they were intended. The practices are what we do to support students. So when we know what outcomes we want to see, we need to choose what evidence-based practices do we need to implement in order to support our students. We also know that it's not just enough to do or implement practices. We want to make sure that we have systems to support adults. Again, those systems can include what are our teaming structures, what is our data decision-making process, how are we going to communicate between different teams, and of course, how are we going to involve families and community stakeholders. So again, this is all based on implementation logic. And so we know that Pbis is not just a one-person job, it's using a team approach and to make sure that we are using our systems to drive our practices. And of course, the ongoing data is what helps us make our decisions. So our second visual that we use to ground Pbis in is a multi-tier prevention logic. And so I know that many of you all are probably familiar with the triangle. But just to review, we use this tiered approach, focusing on how do we use prevention strategies as much as possible. And in order to do that, we start off with our tier 1, where we are using or implementing practices that serve all students, all staff in all settings. And our tier 1 is our school-wide or our classroom systems. And then we may need to layer on some targeted supports. And again, that's what we call our tier 2, where it's a little bit more specialized or targeted. And then our tier 3 is layered on if tier 1 and tier 2 are not enough. And again, that is specialized or individualized supports where we're increasing the intensity of our, not only our supports, but also our progress monitoring. And those might be for students with high risk behaviors. So this tiered approach, or this triangle as we like to use, and I think we can go on to the next slide. Again, we want to make sure that we are tiering interventions and supports. We're not tiering students. And so this triangle is, as you can see, it doesn't have lines in it. And it's just so that we can remember that interventions should be fluid. We want to make sure that we're, first of all, establishing our tier 1 for all students. But at times, students are going to need maybe targeted or at some point maybe intensive interventions, but they may not be permanent, right? We want to make sure that how do we make sure that students are getting what they need in a timely manner? And we're also looking at the needs of the whole child. So it's not just behavior, but it's also looking at social emotional wellness, academics, and then mental wellness. And then layered on is using a lens that's trauma informed, culturally responsive, and we may also use a restorative approach if we're trained on that. And how do we incorporate restorative practices within this triangle? So today we're going to be talking about just the core features of Pbis. And these are 5 ways we can use systems to support every student to be successful in school. Again, we're going to be talking about tier 1. Again, tier 1 is what we're doing for all students. It could be school-wide, or if you're in the classroom, you can also be using or looking at this triangle as a way to look at your whole class. So depending on what role you're in, we're going to use that triangle, that prevention logic, to figure out how we can implement Pbis with fidelity. And then we also want to note that that researchers from the Cedar Center and as well as CEC, which is the Council of Exceptional Children, they have published a book as well as set up a website where they were looking at high leverage practices on what are some practices that we can identify that have the most impact on student outcomes. And as you can see, we pulled out the practices that we'll be talking about in PBIS, which include tiered behavior systems, teaching and reinforcing behavior expectations, classroom management plans, and so forth. That all of these are evidence-based practices that have been identified as high leverage practices for students, and not just special education students. Again, it's applicable for all students. Okay, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Christian.
All right, thank you, Jessica. So let's get started talking a little bit about data-driven decision-making and how it is core to the work that we do within the Pbis framework. So when we look at Pbis and we look at the systems, we want to think about what features of Pbis really help make sure that our systems are equitable. And so we know that if we're able to do a few of these things, we are able to decrease the disproportionality of students of color and students with disabilities being pushed out of our classrooms and pushed out of learning environments. So regular use of data for decision-making, implementation of these classroom Pbis systems that we're going to talk about, and use of formal acknowledgement systems all predict more equitable learning environments. So when we're thinking about why we are doing this work, we want to make sure that we have this in the back of our head as the priority, as something that matters to us as educators and as people implementing this work. We also want to ground ourselves in the reality of our current data and current experiences of our students. We know that our students of color are more likely to receive out-of-school suspensions than their white students. They are overrepresented in out-of-school suspension, both once and more than once. And we also know that our students of color are also more likely to receive an in-school suspension than white students. And so knowing this, we have to make sure that we are designing our systems to be more equitable and to use data in better ways. Finally, we also know that students with disabilities are overrepresented in the out-of-school suspension, both for receiving one out-of-school suspension and more than one out-of-school suspension. So when we're thinking about designing systems, we have to think about what data we are collecting to inform the decisions that we're making. Are we using student engagement data, the family need? Are we thinking about the positive contacts home and collecting data on how many of those we're making? Are we thinking about student work completion, observations, attendance, discipline referrals? We want to make sure that we're collecting data, analyzing it, and using that data in disaggregated ways to make sure that we are paying attention to equity and to access for our students with disabilities and for our students of color specifically. And we also want to make sure that we're allowing access to the people who make decisions daily to actually analyze the data. So we don't want these data and this analysis and this knowledge to just live in our leader's head, our principal's head, our district leader's head. We want to make sure that it's actually able to be presented in front of teachers so that way they can use this knowledge to make better choices too. So when we think about using our data, we want to make sure that we are moving from having these general primary statements to having more precise statements that actually help us make an actionable plan about what to do with this information. So for example, if you had a primary statement like students are disrespecting each other in the chat. If you had that as one of your primary statements, it's a problem that maybe a teacher would bring to a grade level meeting, to a PLC, right? We want to move those kind of statements over to precise statements that actually use the data that we have to understand why these behaviors might be occurring, when they are occurring, how often they are occurring, and with whom are they occurring. So we have moving from students are disrespectful in the chat to there are 10 teacher referrals for inappropriate language in the chat box in 5th grade. So we know how often, we know what the behavior is, and we know who it is, the 5th graders. They are most likely to occur during whole group instruction with a large number of students, and the behaviors related to getting access to peer attention. So now we know specifically it's happening in this setting, the whole group instruction setting, and we know why that behavior might be happening for the peer attention, right? And so this moves us as we look at our data and we look at our experiences from having this vague problem to having a more specific problem that is now actionable, that is now allows us to actually think through solutions and take the subjectivity out of that experience. We also want to think about, as we go through our training today, cultural responsiveness and how positive behavior supports can be done in culturally responsive ways. And so we want to make sure that throughout our implementation of Pbis, we are really focusing in on identity, voice, supportive environments, situational appropriateness, and data for equity. So throughout, we're going to allow for time and space to look at each of these components as we are implementing the different sections and systems of positive behavior supports. So we encourage you to always return to these 5 elements to ensure that your approach to positive behavior supports in your virtual classroom is culturally responsive and reflects supportive environments where students actually feel safe. Where it supports the situational appropriateness of some behaviors for our virtual classroom, for our in-person classrooms, and where we're making sure that identity, voice, and equity are prioritized with everything that we do in our implementation. We also really want to make sure that our community and our families are involved in determining what are school appropriate behaviors, what are unacceptable behaviors in school setting, whether that be virtual or at home, and really making sure that staff and our teachers and our students understand the difference between things that are universally unacceptable and behaviors that might be situationally appropriate at different times in different pieces of your life. If you're interested in reading more about how this is applied by the Pbis Center, you can look in that folder that we shared at the beginning of the training to see the Pbis Cultural Responsiveness Field Guide, which has some extra resources, and we'll actually share some pieces of that throughout our training today, but it is there for you in that folder or on pbis.org. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and talk about setting clear expectations, and I'm going to pass it over to Jessica to discuss this.
Great. So yes, setting clear expectations. And I know that this webinar is about how do we apply the same concepts, but in the virtual classroom. So I'm going to be kind of going using a hybrid approach, if you will. So talking about what it is and then how can we leverage this system and apply it into the virtual classroom. All right, so how do you set clear expectations for your students in the virtual classroom? So just like we did in the physical classroom, we want to make sure that we're keeping these expectations to 3 to 5 positive classroom or school expectations. But in this case, if you're in your virtual classroom, if you don't have anything school-wide, then it's important to figure out what those positive classroom expectations would be. So the first thing is to share, define, and then teach these 3 to 5 positive expectations. As you're creating them, and we're going to be showing you some examples soon, they need to be observable, measurable, positively stated, understandable, and always applicable. We want to teach expectations using examples and non-examples. So making sure that we're explicit in what we mean by these expectations, and then give opportunities to have students practice and also receive feedback. So again, we're using an instructional approach to teaching behavior expectations, just as we would for academics. We want to make sure that we're involving students in defining these expectations with within our classroom routines. So we want to make sure, how do we get buy-in? By, again, including student voice, and then also going back to what Christian was talking about in how to be cultural responsive, how do we also give opportunities for families and other community stakeholders to provide input on what these expectations are, so that we are, again, reflecting the values of the community that we're serving. And then figuring out, how do we come to an agreement or a collective agreement with students to commit in supporting these expectations within our classroom. So again, just reiterating the importance of being culturally responsive. I won't read this whole thing, but we also just want to reiterate, how do we examine our current expectations or rules so that we're making sure that it's not, it doesn't have any implicit bias, and that we're also making sure that there's communication between parents and school staff. So behavior expectations may look different between in the classroom and what happens at home. And we need to make sure that we're recognizing what those differences are. And then again, giving opportunities to include input from our families and parents. We also want to make sure that we are being very explicit on what certain things mean. So again, the examples and non-examples of what those interactions may be between staff and students. Okay. So when we're designing these expectations for the virtual classroom, just like we did in our physical in-person classroom, we want to try to think about, what are the most typical instructional activities that we are routinely utilizing in our virtual classroom? How do we allow for smooth teacher and student movement? And how do we assure that instructional materials are organized and accessible? And then what is our system for making sure that those materials are provided to students in a way that they can easily access them? So considerations may include using technology, for example, the use of video, audio, chat boxes, and breakout rooms. So if these are things that you normally encompass in your day-to-day instruction, what are the expectations you're going to provide and explicitly teach to students about their use of video? Does it have to be on all the time? Does it have to be on just as much as possible? What are those clear expectations that you want to teach and make known very early on, right? We don't want to change the rules of the game midway through the year. We want to make sure that they know the expectations of what they need to do with video. Same thing with audio, teaching them how to mute and unmute themselves in an appropriate time. Their use of language in chat boxes, all right, what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. And then breakout rooms. What are the behavior expectations when they do go into small group discussions throughout these breakout rooms? So here's, I'm going to be showing you just a couple of examples of a classroom matrix. There's also, we're going to be putting resources in the folder where you can access more examples, but this just kind of shows you that you have the 3 expectations written on the left, and then up top, horizontally, you'll see the regular routines that are practiced within a typical classroom experience. So, for example, entering class, you'll see that under safe, respectful, responsible, that there are specific rules positively stated on what should be expected as they enter the classroom, your virtual classroom. Same thing goes for the teacher-led whole group instruction, one-on-one instruction, small group activities. So that's one example of how you can set up your classroom matrix. The next one just shows how, for those of you who are doing Pbis and restorative practices in the virtual classroom, again, you'll see the expectations on top this time. And then along the left side, you'll see that you have some regular routines, but you also have something for the community circle. So if you are a restorative school and you use circles a lot, you can incorporate this in your Pbis matrix. And again, it has specific expectations about what to expect, for example, in your community circles. All right, so we'll go on to the next topic, which is behavior-specific praise. And Christian, you're up.
All right, so let's get started. Woohoo! So we want to focus on the positive, on this behavior-specific praise, because we know where attention goes, energy flows. So we want to make sure that we are feeding our energy into the positive things that are happening in our classroom and keep that positivity there because we all know that this has been a very troubling, traumatic, and hard time for so many of our students and for ourselves. And so the more that we can focus on that positivity, the better it will be for us and for our students. So when we think about our positive feedback, how much positive feedback we should be giving, the positive to corrective ratio of feedback should be 5 to 1. That colon ended up on the wrong side. All right, it should be 5 positive pieces of feedback to every 1 corrective piece of feedback. And by corrective, it does not say negative, it says corrective, which is meaning even if you say, can you put your pencil down? That's not necessarily a negative piece of feedback, but it is corrective. And so we want to have, in successful classrooms, to shape behavior, 5 pieces of positive feedback for every 1 corrective. And this is not just for students, it applies to adults and business teams too. So we know that teams with low performing teams, they have 1 positive for every 2.7 negative piece of feedback. Medium performing teams have 2 positive pieces of feedback for every 1 negative, and high performing teams have 5.5 positive to 1 negative piece of feedback. So we know that this applies to not only our students, but also ourselves in terms of getting us to be successful members of a team. So when we think about what type of positive praise is the most effective, there is a specific type called behavior-specific praise. And this type of praise helps adults and students focus on the positive social behaviors and actions that students are completing. It is a powerful tool for behavioral change because it increases the likelihood students will use that recognized behavior and those skills in the future. It also can decrease the inappropriate behavior that other students might engage in. And so that also reduces the need for correction. And it also helps build that self-esteem and helps build that internal locus of control to say that I know what to do, I know what is right, and if I keep doing it, then I'll keep getting these positive praise and the positive social acknowledgement for those things. So when we're building our behavior-specific praise, it needs to be descriptive, specific, because specific is in the title, so it is also in the definition. It should be linked to those school-wide expectations that Jessica just talked about. It should be in that 5 to 1 ratio, and it should be delivered right away. So here's an example of behavior-specific praise that you might give to our little ant friend who is helping their partner get across from the piece of wood to the next piece of wood. So you might say 1 flick, that is specific. You're telling him who it is. I saw you lending Ant-Man a hand. So that's descriptive, right? We're saying the behavior that we actually want to see when he got separated from the colony. I appreciate you wanting him to be safe, connecting it to the school-wide expectations while we form the bridge. Thank you. So this really helps Flick know exactly what he did correctly, know exactly how he showed the school-wide expectations, and understand how to get that same positive praise again because we're sharing that behavior that he did. When we're looking at behavior-specific praise, here are some non-examples like good job, thank you, 1 more time, and I'll mute you, Donald. We might not all want to admit that, but it's definitely something that we know can be said in moments of stress. So we want to make sure that we are saying the student's name, that we're saying the behavior, and saying what value it connects to. So for example, Jalen, I'm so happy to see you signaling for help. Great job communicating your needs. Or Nora, you're doing a fantastic job using icons in the chat box to participate in our discussion. It really seems to help the classroom flow smoothly. Or even better, praising a student who is doing the positive behavior instead of focusing on Donald, who might not be doing exactly what we need them to do. So thank you for your thoughtful contribution to the chat box, Anthony. So these examples show how we can expand our positive praise to really include that behavior and that value to help increase the likelihood that students will do it again. We also can think about how we can use general praise and non-contingent attention to help shape the positivity in our classroom. So here's a quote from Sprick, which says, when a teacher makes the effort to engage with every student individually, students learn and internalize that they are valued, reducing the likelihood that they will misbehave. So when we think about providing non-contingent attention, that just means attention that isn't dependent on any type of behavior from our students. Our students don't have to do anything to earn this type of attention. And it really shows them that we care about them as people. And it shows them that we're there for them no matter what happened before and no matter what happens after, that we are there to give them that positive relationship and give them that positive attention that they need. And so some ideas of how to do this would be greeting students by name as they enter your virtual classroom, doing daily hellos by video, doing social media messages, having your morning meetings, doing community building activities virtually either at the start of all your classes or having special time that you schedule, and also allowing for those check-in calls, chats, and emails to make sure that you stay connected. And so it's not just when a student misses a class or when a student doesn't turn in their work, but also just scheduled times where you can connect with your students or you allow them to connect with each other. So when we're thinking about specific behaviors that we want to see, we can also think about how they connect to the pro-social skills and those social emotional learning skills that we know are so important for our students. So we know that as we are praising our students and showing these specific behaviors, we can connect them to those ideas like self-awareness, like self-management, like responsible decision-making that we know are super important for our students' lives, right? And important for our lives too. So we know that as we praise our students for these specific behaviors, we can include those social emotional learning skills too. So in the folder that we shared with you earlier today, there is a self-assessment tool that you can use to see where you're at in providing your behavior-specific praise. And so I think it's really helpful, especially as you are thinking about maybe entering back into the physical classroom, or if you're continuing in the virtual classroom, it can help give you a snapshot of where you're at in terms of your praise and your error correction, and give you next steps in thinking about how I can do a better job of incorporating positive praise into my classroom. I definitely did this as a teacher, and what I learned was that my ratio was nowhere close to 5-to-1. I was at a 2-to-1, even though I see myself as a very positive person and see myself as giving a lot of praise. I was not giving as much as I thought. And as soon as I changed that about my classroom, it became a more positive environment. I was much happier. My students were much happier to be in that classroom because they felt like I appreciated the things that they were doing and that I noticed each and every one of them. So I would just suggest this activity. If you're a coach, definitely look into this tool and see where you are at yourself in providing that praise. All right, so speaking of praise, we're now going to move on to talking about acknowledgments and acknowledgement systems in the virtual classroom. So I'll pass it over to Jessica.
Thank you. All right, so acknowledgments. So just similar to behavior-specific praise and how that works for adults, same thing goes with acknowledgments. We all like to get acknowledged as adults. And we often see it in things like cash back systems, right? When we're shopping, loyalty programs, special coupons, newsletter specials, and even at work, right? Pay grade increase obviously is motivating. Again, it just kind of just reiterates that being acknowledged as adults is great, right? And that there are programs and systems set up to help it make it more exciting and more motivating to reinforce certain behaviors. So again, like just times like right now, when exercise may be a challenging behavior for us to do, there are systems that we can layer on top of behavior specific praise that we may get from a coach or someone at the gym, that there are systems that help reinforce that. So if you are like me and need a Fitbit watch or something to give you that feedback in helping you obtain your goals, then that is something that you can also apply in your classroom. So we're going to talk about some ideas on how you can set that up. So how do I acknowledge my students in the virtual classroom? So some basic guidelines, again, is to still go back to that 5-to-1 positive to neutral or corrective ratio that Christian talked about. So that is an ongoing practice that you want to maintain. But it's also layering on ways of building community and joy, and then providing this system consistently, and we're also making sure that we're providing that predictability, so that this is not something that is just done once a year or once a month because you felt like you needed to do something different, but this should be ongoing. This should be part of your classroom system so that you're constantly making it more exciting or more motivating. Again, on top of the 5-to-1 positive ratio that you're trying to aim for as well. All right, so going back to, again, the basics of what acknowledgement and incentive systems are. So acknowledgement is basically saying when we see the expected behavior that we're trying to teach, we acknowledge it because we're trying to increase the likelihood of continued positive behavior. Again, that's through the behavior specific praise. And it may also be nonverbal. It could just be an acknowledgement of a head nod, a thumbs up, right? Just that proximity of saying, I see you and good job, but I'm going to pair that with what you're doing. But we also, again, may want to layer on an incentive system. I want to say incentive system because I don't want that to be confused with rewards or a student store. If you're doing that and are able to maintain that, good job, good for you. But I know from many teachers, being one myself before, is that is hard to sustain, right? You're going to be broke by 1 month into the school year. So we want to layer on an incentive system, but to focus on more social and relationship building activities that can be still tied to an incentive system. So let's try to find fun ways on how we can motivate students to do that. So going back to the why is that we want to actively teach students what behaviors are expected of them. We want to make sure that we're increasing the likelihood that they'll engage in that. And then we're also providing those opportunities to build and maintain those positive adult-student relationships. And again, we're just also encouraging students to demonstrate positive social emotional skills and behaviors. So by naming it and by acknowledging it, we're making them more aware of what they're doing. And again, all of this is to create a positive school climate so that we're, again, counteracting with all the negative behaviors that are happening. We want to focus our energy and attention, again, to the positive. So what does this look like in the virtual world? Again, we want to make it easy and as efficient as possible. We don't want to layer on more work, right? So some guidelines on how to do that. First of all, we want to refer to the matrix. So if you have that matrix set up, then we always want to pair our acknowledgement to whatever behaviors we're trying to teach using that language that is spelled out in the matrix. And we do that by using the behavior specific praise. Other ways we can do that, we want to make sure that we're using polls, chats, and other forums to increase opportunities for students to respond so that we can reinforce and acknowledge them. And again, we want to use acknowledgement systems that may be at the that are in the individual, the classroom, or the grade level or school-wide. So you can do individual contingency systems, or you can do it by group, grade level, or school. So different levels make it more engaging and more exciting. And it also provides that equity opportunity so that we know that every student has an opportunity to feel successful, right? If we only rely on the individual acknowledgement systems, then we risk that chance that students may not have that opportunity to feel successful. But if we do it as a team or as a group contingency, that there's going to be that feeling of success from every student. So some sample systems, and this is, again, is not exhaustive of other things, and I'm sure you all have some creative ways of doing that. You'll see that some have, schools have created badges. Some are currently using their dojo system if it's only used for acknowledgement. Again, we don't take away points. We just want to focus on acknowledgement. So we're giving points, but not taking away. You can use Google Forms to provide individual tickets so that we can keep track of what behaviors we're acknowledging. Or just something that's not on here, you can also use Jamboard or Padlet to do group contingency points. So if you have group 1, group 2, group 3, and you just do a tally chart of how many points students or groups of students are earning, that would be an easy way to do a group contingency system. And then as an incentive ideas, again, going back to what I said earlier, is to take away the gift cards or the tangible stuff, but really focus on what are things that they would enjoy and what would be age appropriate. So some examples can be game day, having a talent show, maybe a virtual recess, a virtual field trip, something creative where we can still do it virtually from a distance. And then also maybe a homework pass if that's applicable or appropriate. Again, all these different creative ideas, but again, it's reinforcing the relationship building and social opportunities for students who just may want more opportunities to connect and do fun things in addition to what they're all the academic stuff that they're doing. And I encourage you to just ask your students, what would be some ideas that you would enjoy that we can set aside time to as a goal for reaching, and reaching our incentives. Again, just a reminder, we want to make sure that whatever system that we build, that we're making it accessible to all students. We often hear those students always get the prize or always get, the free time, right? We want to make sure that every student has the opportunity to feel successful. Link, again, the acknowledgement system to our school expectations or values, and then making it visible and clear so that students know where they're at. They're getting that constant feedback, just like a Fitbit would give you feedback. We want to make sure that that system is clear and visible for all. All right, and Christian will now go to responding to behavior, because we cannot ignore certain behaviors, but how do we respond in a positive way? So Christian, that is you're up.
All right, let's jump in. So when we're thinking about responding to behaviors, I don't know if we've said the word proactive or positive enough in this training, but here it is again. So we want to think about how our responses can really be proactive to some of the challenging behaviors that we might see specifically in the virtual classroom. So here is a quick, funny cartoon. Instead of calling my mom, how would you feel about exploring a more positive and preventative strategy, right? So we want to think about how we can be proactive and pay attention, look for patterns, anticipate the problems, and have a solution in place that really promotes the things we want to see versus waiting for something to happen and acting, which we know is less effective and can get in the way of having those positive relationships that we want with our students. So In order for us to be able to respond to behavior, first we have to make sure that we have our preventions in place. These are the things that we talked about today in this training: defining, teaching, and practicing the behaviors we want to see with the expectations, establishing your routines, creating the systems for behavior-specific praise, and then setting up your acknowledgement systems. So we want to make sure that any discipline and any response to behavior is really complementary to these expectations and acknowledgement systems that we have set up in our classroom, because that's the only way that is going to be successful. We also want to make sure that as we are responding to challenging behaviors, we are realizing the impact and the prevalence of trauma with our students and within ourselves. We recognize the trauma signs and symptoms with our students within ourselves, and that we're using those trauma-informed approaches that help us not re-traumatize our students as we are trying to shape their behavior towards more positive and interactive ways. So we really want to make sure that we are thinking about the impact of this past year, plus structural trauma that students might be experiencing, and community trauma that they might be experiencing, and have that in our minds. And also think about the trauma that we have experienced and how that might be impacting our ability to be self-aware, our ability to self-manage and regulate ourselves. So definitely having those that knowledge and those ideas in our minds before we start responding to behavior will help us be successful. We also want to think about how we can be culturally responsive in our response to behavior, and make sure that we're taking an instructional approach to discipline that emphasizes those pro-social skills that we know that students need. We also want to make sure that we look at our policies and our practices to make sure that they're equitable and that they think about power versus purpose. And so making sure that it's not we're making these rules because I am in charge and I'm the one enforcing them, but that there's an actual purpose behind each of these things that we ask our students to do and each of the ways that we ask them to behave. So some non-examples are on the left, examples are on the right. So we want to make sure that we're not using a zero tolerance approach, that we're not using those informal suspensions that are not reported to OSSI. That we are making sure that we're not just having punishment used, that we also have space for teaching of the behaviors and allowing families to give input. Some positive examples of what we would want to do is having our teams and our staff really review our discipline policies, making sure that they're inclusive. Having our teams seek input from students themselves who are experiencing this, from their families and from their community. And then also making sure that we have a procedure of how we respond to behavior by reteaching or teaching the behaviors that were expected, teaching those replacement behaviors so that way students know what the expectations are, have practiced them, and then have a chance to try them out in real settings. So something I want to highlight is that subjectivity is disproportionality's best friend. And so what that means is the more subjectivity, the more interpretation our policies and our rules have, the easier it is for bias to show up in them. So the easier it is for Black students, for students with disabilities, to have these rules inequitably ascribed to them, to have punishments be harsher upon them. And so we want to make sure that as we have problem behaviors occur, that we are clearly defining what they look like, what they sound like. Because we know that things like disruption or things like respect are very much infused with culture and can be interpreted in different ways depending on who you are. And so we want to make sure that as a staff or as a team, that even in the virtual world, we have definitions for each of these big buckets of challenging behaviors students might be showing. And that helps teachers and students all be on the same page of what is expected, both what is expected of them, but what are these behaviors that we don't want to see, what do they look like, what do they sound like, and we're all on the same page. We also want to think and brainstorm as a team what are some challenging behaviors that we have seen, and what are some prevention strategies that we can put in place, whether that is pre-teaching behaviors that we would like, whether that is creating acknowledgement systems specifically around those things, right? So if we know that a challenging behavior is inappropriate language in the chat, how can we teach and provide structure around what appropriate language is? If a challenging behavior is that students are not showing up on time to class, how can we create acknowledgement systems and an incentive system that really encourages students to come on time? So really spending time with your team thinking about what are some things we can do for the behaviors that we're seeing. As we do that work, we also want to think about the ABCs of behavior and have a functional approach to our thinking. So any behavior, whether you're an adult or a child, it has a function. There's a reason that we behave that way. The ABCs include the antecedent, or what happens before, and then we have the behavior, the B, which is what we actually do, and then we have the consequences, which are either positive or negative. It doesn't just have to be the negative things, and it could be things we don't think of or things we don't see, right? So these help us really, if we use the ABCs to behavior, it helps us analyze why students might be behaving the way that they are and how we can either change what happens before or change what happens after to shape that behavior. And so it really helps give us an inquisitive and curious frame of mind to approach the behaviors that we might be seeing in our classroom. So it's definitely a tool to use to really think about how you can approach specific behaviors you're seeing as you analyze how to make a plan moving forward. We also want to make sure that we develop a continuum of strategies to respond to inappropriate behavior. So on the left, we have kind of least invasive approaches, and on the right, we have more invasive approaches. So on the left, we have things like planned ignoring, signal nonverbal cues to students, behavior specifically praising other students, or redirecting a student. Then on the right, we have more invasive, which are reminding of expectations, specific error correction, providing a choice for the student, and having an individual chat. And so each of these strategies can be used in the form of a continuum, right, in the form of a ladder. And as we go down, we get more invasive. And so they can be used in the virtual classroom, just like they are in the physical classroom, to help shape that behavior. So I would really encourage you, if you're a classroom teacher, to look at your responses, maybe things you naturally do, and think about how you might layer in some of these less invasive responses before you get to the more invasive, or layer in some of these other steps before you get to the more invasive steps. And so here's another slide of those, the reteaching, the behavior-specific error correction, which models the behavior-specific praise, really making sure the student knows the exact behavior that is undesired and helping them engage in that desired behavior. Providing choice, and then conference with the student. All of these can be done in the virtual classroom, and having these spelled out really helps both you and the student commit to using that continuum and understanding that what my cue is when I reteach a behavior, what I'm trying to tell you. When I provide you choice, what am I trying to tell you? Well, I'm trying to tell you that the way that you're behaving right now is not helping us be successful in the classroom, right? And so it gives that transparency to both you and the kid. We also can think about corrective consequences as a ladder. And so you can, and these are all appropriate for the virtual classroom. So having a private chat with the student, emailing the parents, setting up a call, having a parent sit with the student while in class, and then having a community circle. We want to make sure that anything we do with our students is not shaming, just because we know that this time has been extremely difficult, and shame only helps push students farther away from the classroom and doesn't make them feel positive about rejoining. So anytime that we are providing a consequence, we want to make sure that it is done with respect and dignity for our students and for our families. And so, if you were to have a parent sit with the student in class, you would want to make sure that that is not a shameful experience, but a supportive cheerleader experience for the student to understand what it would look like to be successful in the classroom. We can also use restorative questions when thinking about how to respond to behavior. So thinking about what happened, what were you thinking and feeling at the time, who is being affected by your actions, what impact has this had on you, and what do you think you need to do to make things right? And so using those as a guide can really help you be successful in restoring and repairing the relationship to move forward. And we know that relationships are the foundation to learning. So hopefully this section gives you some ideas of how to structure your response to challenging behaviors that you might find. But just a reminder, you have to have those layered on all those other preventative items, the expectations, the positive specific phrase, the acknowledgement systems, in order for these continuum of responses to actually work. All right, so we're moving into closing. So just to review, today we talked about how to create the positive systems in the virtual classroom. We talked about setting clear expectations. We talked about behavior-specific phrase. We talked about acknowledgement systems, and we talked about responding to behaviors. But Jessica, I'd love for you to talk about this slide.
Yes, so we always want to make sure that we need to connect before you correct, really relying on relationships in order for us to work with our students in a more effective manner. So again, before you start to flip your lid and get angry with a student, take a breath and then find a way to connect students before you correct them. And that will make your job a lot easier, hopefully.
All right, y'all. So that is the end of our recorded session for today. If you'd like to see more or join us live, you can find our upcoming trainings at this link, aussie.dc.gov/events. You can subscribe to our TAL PD bulletin here, or you can go to our website to find our email addresses, which are here. Please reach out if you have any questions or need any further support. We are here for you. And we hope you have a great rest of your day.
All right, thank you.